Welcome back to the Canadian Real Estate Channel. I'm Adam J.D. Martin, your host here today, and we're going to be talking about 4 factors that are going to influence house prices in 2024. As most of you know, the last few years has been a pretty wild ride, and a bunch of factors have come into play in terms of influencing the big spike in house prices that we saw in 2021, and then the decline over the last couple of years to where we are now in 2024. I'm hoping in this video to unpack for you some of the things that I think are really important and going to influence the prices going forward into 2024 and beyond. These factors are always true. It doesn't really matter what's going on in the market itself or the price point today. The point of this video is to give you some tools to look at so that you can look at the market and get some information and understand what you should be seeing in the market regardless of what's going on. Okay, these things are always true. These are the guidelines that you can use to stay informed and make great decisions as you invest in 2024 and moving forward. The first factor I wanted to talk to you about today is economic factors. Many of you guys have been following along and hearing lots in the news about things like the gross domestic product, GDP, and inflation. And we've had greater inflation in the last few years than we've seen in 40 years. Our target rates are usually between 2 to 3%, but for the last couple of years, we've been over that 3% mark. And today, people are paying over 20% more for groceries than they have been in the last 3 years. Okay, so over 3 years, grocery prices for that same basket of goods has gone up about 20% or more. And what that does is it affects the average Canadian's ability to actually save the money they need to purchase a house. And that's going to affect affordability overall. But that's not all that's going to affect us. The second factor that we always want to look at is rates. A lot of you have been hearing the news about rates. Some of you probably even have enjoyed great rates in the past. When we see things like rates increasing, we have the same level of demand for the actual properties. The problem is for the seller that the affordability now of every buyer in the market has changed. So while the sellers still need to sell and the buyers still need to buy, the price points at which they can actually transact and meet in the middle have drastically changed. As the A-level financing has gone to 6%, 5 to 6%, and the B-level financing has gone well over 6%, and private is up around 15%, depending on who you're borrowing from. What we've seen here now is properties sit on the market a lot longer. And as properties sit on the market, more and more come in every single month and add to that supply. So more properties coming to market that sit for longer must demand a lower price point, because what ends up happening is the people that need to sell still need to sell on whatever timeline is motivating them to actually sell, whether that's a new job, whether that's a change in their lifestyle, or just overall the demand to get out of a certain property. Maybe they have delayed capital expenditure that they need to invest in the property, and they actually can't afford to make those payments today to actually maintain the property. So they need to get out. In fact, I've even found myself in a similar position where my cash flow has been affected by the changing rates, and so I must sell a building to free up some capital. What ends up happening in that market condition is that I must sell, and a buyer doesn't necessarily have to buy. You have to remember that it's usually the seller that's actually on the timeline here, because they woke up and decided to sell that property. So for the buyer, what it means for them is they now have more options. And while their financing is more expensive, there's more supply building up on the market, giving them more choices. And what that does is it forces price down, because the seller actually needs to action their motivation. They need to actually sell. So supply and demand is going to be affected by the economic factors, by the rates increasing, and by things like immigration and interprovincial moving. Another factor to consider, and the fourth and final factor to consider, is government policy and regulations. Things like zoning, things like taxes, things like foreign buyer taxes, and stress tests. Some of the things that have all been introduced to the market in the past few years are all affecting the pricing of housing today. So some things like the foreign buyer tax act to bring prices down because you have less money coming in from foreign sources. The idea there being that domestic capital, domestic buyers can actually afford to buy more houses. But it gets in the way of more money coming into the market, and that can affect building. Now, when we stack that on with different building regulations, as you all know, in Canada, we're fairly heavily regulated when it comes to actual building permits and when it comes to our standards. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it keeps us all safe and it makes sure that there's things in place like the fire code, which I think are great things to have. but you have to consider the fact that those all reduce the actual ability for people to transact in the market because it reduces supply and artificially increases price. That's another factor that can play around with price and something that you want to look at under any market conditions, not just 2024 conditions. So what we want to look forward to when we're looking at what's going to happen in the market in 2024 is we want to consider things like the economic factors. What's going on with our GDP? Are we actually producing more than what we're spending as an economy as a whole? That's macroeconomics. Now, microeconomics, we want to understand how is the average consumer being influenced and being stressed by things like inflation. If we continue in 2024 to stay over the 3% inflation mark, that could probably lead the Bank of Canada to continue either increasing rates or keep them the same, or very slowly reduce the actual rates from the bank rate. And if that happens, that's going to have a more broad effect on affordability for the average Canadian, which will in turn create downward pressure on the price for houses in the whole market. Supply and demand is another big factor that we need to pay close attention to. In 2024, the Canadian government so far has announced that they want to continue hitting their immigration numbers. So if we don't see things like reduced regulations, if we don't see things like lax zoning, if we don't see things like greater density in our building, then I think we should continue to see a bit of a counterbalance in terms of price. So while rates are forcing prices down, we will also have upward pressure from things like regulations getting in the way of us building more homes. The reality is there's a housing shortage and there's a lot of people coming into Canada. Our population as it stands is only roughly 34 million. But we have 500,000 immigrants coming into this country all of the time. What ends up happening there is that more people are coming in than houses are being supplied. So while rates are going to influence the housing market, and the GDP is going to influence the housing market, and CPI and inflation are all going to influence the housing market with downward pressure, we still have a ton of people coming in that are all coming in with capital and are all going to be coming in looking for housing. Now, that doesn't all mean they're going to buy houses. We're not going to have enough houses for 500,000 people to buy, but what will end up happening is there will be greater demand for rentals. And as greater demand for rent increases, and we see that trend all the time, rent is always going up. And what happens is when rent goes up, the affordability of investors like you, that goes up. And when the investors' affordability goes up, the housing prices rise across the market. So we have a bit of a counterbalance in our market, and I think it's worthwhile to look at these four factors and see what's actually happening. If we see greater GDP, if we see less inflation, if we see rates go down, if we see immigration continue, if we see more density in our building and less regulation and greater flexibility in our zoning, prices go up. But if we see inflation continue to rise, rates continue to rise or stay the same while inflation rises, GDP decrease or stay the same and not match inflation, okay? If we see rates stay high, if we see that building regulations don't change, if we see that zoning stays the same, taxes continue to increase, and government policy stays the same, the market absolutely has no room to go up. And remember, guys, we're still tracking perfectly. If you exclude 2021 data, go back in your market, research your market, look at the data, and exclude the data from 2021, you will see that we are perfectly on track. Nothing has happened. You need to exclude the data from a global pandemic. It doesn't count. It's absolutely not part of the data set that you should be using. So look at all those factors, use those to inform your decisions, and I hope that this video has been informative for what you can look at to help inform your decision on how to invest in 2024.